I want to start off by understanding what the concept of resurrection is, and then what makes this such a challenging thing to believe that can actually happen from a metaphysical perspective. We're going to bridge from that into understanding the materialist argument, or the argument that's against resurrection. And then we're going to kind of explore the broad range of different views of what you are and then of how you could resurrect based on what you think people are. So that will kind of involve attacking the two different premises of this argument, the first premise being that resurrection is actually possible even on materialism, and then the second premise being that you are not a material thing, that you are an immaterial thing and you could resurrect that way. So I will take you from your Christian foundations all the way up to the big scary world of metaphysics. Any questions so far? You'll also notice I talk really fast. If there's something you want me to slow down on or a question you have, just raise your hand and yell at me. I will not be offended. Okay. So first and foremost, resurrection is a doctrine that is central to Christian beliefs. You want proof of that? Here's the Apostles' Creed. It's one of the oldest creeds held by Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants. All Christians everywhere believe this. And it says, I believe in Jesus Christ, crucified, died, and buried. He descended to the dead, and on the third day he rose again. Here's the Nicene Creed, another creed, again, like the Apostles' Creed, held by all Christians everywhere. And it says, we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ incarnate, made man, crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death and was buried. On the third day he rose again in accordance with the Scriptures. We look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. So not only in this do you have that Christ was died and rose again, which we just celebrated this Sunday, so great timing, right? But we also have the fact that generally people who have died will be resurrected and have life in the world to come. So this is critical for our resurrection as well, for our eternal life, right? But how do we understand this Easter event? Because if you start looking in the Bible, it's rather weird. You have in John 20 that Jesus traveled through locked doors and he disappeared, right? You also have that on the road to Emmaus when he was walking with his disciples, he was unrecognized. But then at the end, later, he was suddenly recognized, and then poof, he vanishes, right? John 20 here as well, he showed up to the apostles and he ate with them and they touched his wounds, right? He says, I'm not a ghost. Touch me, feel my wounds, touch my hands. And Thomas, of course, who doubted, touched and was convinced, right? And then you have another event also in Luke 24 and John where Christ is cooking fish and eating fish with the disciples at the shore. But there's this idea that it seems like he's maybe not recognized or fully understood, right? So that's that aspect from just the Gospels. And then if you look in the early epistles and some of the earliest letters we have, you have some kind of claims that are equally confusing by Paul. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. Sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. The first man was of the dust of the earth. The second man is of heaven. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. The perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, the mortal with immortality. In 2 Corinthians, he says stuff similar. He says, for we know that if the earthly tent, and he's referring to our bodies in that case, that we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built with human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. So these are kind of some challenging and confusing statements. What do we mean by resurrection? Well, I actually want to go to our atheist friend Bart Ehrman, who's a very well-respected New Testament scholar, and ask him what is Paul saying in these passages. And what you'll say that he says is, in ancient ways of thinking, the body was not the only material part of a human. Humans also have souls and spirits. For ancient people, souls and spirits were material entities, not immaterial entities as they are for us. For us, the difference between soul and body is visible and invisible, material and immaterial, substantial and insubstantial. That is not how the ancients saw it. For the ancients, soul and spirit were made up of stuff. They were material entities, but their material was much finer, more refined than the clunky shell of our body. And so, if an ancient apocalypse like Paul talked about a spiritual body, he meant a body that is no longer made up of just this clunky meat. It is a body of a more refined substance. It is still matter, but it is a different kind of matter. When Paul thought Jesus was physically raised from the dead, that was not a contradiction to his claim that Jesus had a spiritual body at the resurrection. Spiritual bodies were physical. We too will be raised, for Paul, into spiritual bodies. At that time, we will not have flesh, because sin will no longer have any role to play in our existence. But when he says this, he means it in the ancient, not the modern sense. So he's saying that ancients back in the day viewed the world differently, right? They're not so concerned with atoms and molecules and physical matter stuff. They said there's also more stuff that exists in the universe, but it's real, it's material, it exists. And just in case you don't want to take the word of an atheist, there's another very well-respected New Testament scholar named N.T. Wright who says the same thing. He says, yeah, there's a lot of people who get confused with this. Even well-known bishops suggest that sometimes Paul is referring to a non-physical body. But if you look within the field, a lot of commentators regularly admit that saying that is just not accounting for what the text actually says. This is coming from a Hellenistic worldview that's trying to interpret Paul through a lens that's not accurate. It's not the mere resuscitation of a corpse coming back into the same mode of physicality that it had before, but equally and emphatically, it is not disembodiment. So largely we can take away that Paul is talking about a transformed physical body. Christ's body was human. It was his body, real and truly his body. And your bodies, when you will resurrect, will be your bodies, real and truly your bodies. But they're also transformed. They're unique. They're made of a stuff that's also more, but it's part of the universe and part of the world, right? So just to emphasize this point, here's C.S. Lewis. Again, I want to emphasize it's both bodily and physical. He says, if the truth is that after death there comes a negatively spiritual life, an eternity of mystical experience, what is a more misleading way of communicating it than saying that somebody appeared in the form of a human who eats broiled fish, right? If you want to emphasize that you really just have a soul that's eternal and you kind of live in a spirit form after that, this is a terrible way for the Gospels to go about that. And if you look at a lot of theologians, Karl Barth's one of the most influential theologians of the past century, he says that pretty much the doctrine of bodily resurrection is the basic axiom of the Christian faith. It's the key to the whole, bodily resurrection. We're not just coming back as souls. We're not just going to some spirit place called heaven. We're coming back in body, in flesh. And even the AI gets this, right? AI doesn't always get a lot right, but it says in Christianity, the resurrection is understood to be a physical event where the soul is united with a glorified, incorruptible body. This belief is central to the Christian faith, as it's seen as the cornerstone of salvation. So the AI gets it. I also want to point out that this is eschatological. What do I mean by that? This is something that happens when the world is made new and made right and made as it should be. So it's not just a redescription of death, and it's not a reversal of death. You had a question? Okay. And it's not just life after death. It's life after death. It's when the world is made new and restored. It's when people are made what they truly ought to be from the beginning. And if you want to learn more about this, I'd encourage you to check out this link in our YouTube channel where Zach's talked about that before. But like I said in the beginning, resurrection is, again, central to Christianity. Without it, Christianity falls. So here's Paul again. He says, if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep, and that means dead, in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all most people to be pitied. So, we need the resurrection, right? If Christianity is to be real, is to be a true religion, then the resurrection has to have happened. And our good atheist friends know that. Alvin knows that. So Alvin and Carol, they had a little interaction with a nuclear plant, so forgive their appearance. But long story short, if Alvin goes to Carol and she says, well, do you believe what 1 Corinthians says? And she says, well, of course I do. He's going to come back and say, well, too bad. The resurrection just can't have happened. So your faith is dead and void and Christianity is useless and you should get on with your life, right? And then Carol's going to go, well, actually, and because she's a good girl and she's gone to Ratio Christi and she's learned all the arguments, she's going to spew something like this. Oh my gosh, we can look at all the minimal facts and we can argue for the best explanation of Jesus rising from the dead. And oh my gosh, we can look at like mathematics and the Bayesian approach, take in all the relevant facts and argue that Jesus rose from the dead. And oh my gosh, we can look at the difference between Judaism and early Christianity. And we can look at what kind of could have caused that. And we can say, oh my gosh, Jesus rose from the dead. And I think that this is all great and fine and good. But the problem is Alvin might say, hey, Carol, stop talking. You're totally missing what I'm trying to say. Because Alvin's problem might not be all of this. He might not be worried about the historical stuff. He might be worried about the metaphysics, the actual possibility of resurrecting. He might say that really resurrection is just something that's impossible even if God could do it. It might be like trying to make a square circle. It's just something that can't be. Because no entity can come into existence twice. So let me try to explain where he's coming from and what he's seeing here. This is ancient Rhodes. It's a great city back in the day in ancient Greece, and they had a lot of industrious good people there, and they wanted to make a statue. So they worked really hard, and they made the Colossus of Rhodes. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was awesome. They made this great, golden, awesome thing. And now time has passed, time has gone on, and that statue is gone, right? we can't go and see the statue of Rhodes today. The Colossus is disappeared. Well, let's say that God, tomorrow he comes down and he snaps his fingers, and in an act of creation, he brings the Colossus back, and we see a new Colossus appear in Rhodes. Alvin's concerned that these two Colossus might not be the same. Is this new one that God just snapped into existence out of his fingers really that statue that the people of Rhodes made long, long ago? Well, what makes something persist through change? What would make that statue the statue? There's two kind of thoughts that philosophers have. One is identity, being the thing you are, and one is causality, being caused directly by what came before, or coming after something that was before, that caused you or brought you into existence. And let's look at our two statues, right? So we have the statue that was made by the ancient people of Rhodes long, long ago by their hands, carving meticulously, and we have the statue that God just poofed into existence. Let's label these statue A and statue B, right? Colossus A, it has a very different history from Colossus B. It was made by the people of Rhodes. They built it, they made it. There's certain atoms that went in. They constructed it all of their time and effort. This other statue just kind of poofed into existence. And this other statue, for all we know, maybe all of the atoms in Colossus A are currently being used by other places or other rocks or so forth, so it might not even have the same material either. And Alvin's going to say that means that these two things are not equal. In fact, Colossus B is just a duplicate of Colossus A. And this really sucks, right? Because if you can't really bring Colossus A back because it was in fact totally destroyed or wiped out, then how are we to believe that you can be brought back? You, physically, right? So this is called the duplication problem. Sometimes people also kind of term it the problem of gappy existence. There is a nuance between these. I'm not going to explain it, but there is. And the idea there is, again, if there's some sort of a gap between something, in that gap it gets totally destroyed, it's not really possible to bring it back because nothing maintained its identity across that gap. So really what you're doing at that point is making something new or different. And again, let's just think about this, right? So here is our apostle. We'll call him John. I don't know. He's an apostle back in ancient Rhodes. He gets set on fire. He gets totally destroyed and wiped out. All of his atoms go off into the rest of the world, maybe into you, maybe into the Memorial Student Center. Who knows? They get scattered across everything, right? And then we're expected that across time and space, God just poofs you and the Apostle Paul back into existence. But is this really the Apostle Paul, or is it an imposter? And if you are an imposter in your resurrection, if it's not the you sitting in this chair that comes back, if it's some duplicate of you, aren't the you in this chair pretty ticked off? Is that the eternal life you want, right? That kind of sucks. So we want to avoid this scenario. Now, you're probably thinking, well, Alvin, you're just having an issue. You have a soul. So this is really a non-issue, and I'm not a statue. I'm a soul, right? That's probably your first thought. This is called substance dualism. There's a lot of other names for it, which you can read up there. But essentially, it's the claim that your soul is psychologically continuous with your body, and it remains after your body is gone. So death destroys you, or it destroys your body. It does not destroy you, right? But Alvin might say, well, where's your evidence? Why should I believe in a soul? I don't feel like a soul. I don't see souls. I've never seen one exist. It seems like a pretty out there thing to look at the world and say, well, souls are just naturally a part of it. So I want us to back up and try to see things from Alvin's perspective. Alvin is coming from this perspective of animalism, which says that a human person, you as a person, are identical to the human animal. You're nothing but that changing body. So if your body goes permanently out of existence, totally destroyed, then you would, of course, go permanently out of existence. Souls don't exist. So again, try to put yourself in the headspace that souls don't exist, right? Now, I want to point out that there are a lot of Christians who do this. They put themselves in Alvin's headspace. They, in fact, say that this might work fairly well. So here's Hud Hudson, and he says, some of the most philosophically sophisticated discussions and spirited defenses of materialism for human persons have come from philosophers who identify with Christianity thoroughly, who claim to find grounds for such materialism in that tradition. And we're going to talk about a lot of them later. So Alvin is in good company with some prominent philosophers today. And he was in pretty good company with some prominent thinkers in the past, too. So granted, they had a very different metaphysic and understanding of the world. Let's not deny that. But for 2,000 years, a lot of early Christians and apologists really struggled with people on this issue, on what happened to your body. How did resurrection actually work? Tertullian, in fact, he went so bold as to say that the resurrection of Christ is certain because it's impossible. Now, he did say, but here again, I must have some reasons. So he does qualify himself. But we have to acknowledge that Alvin is joining this great thought tradition, and so we shouldn't just belittle his ideas. So let's understand his argument in its fullest form. This is the materialist argument. he has two essential premises. The first premise is that the general resurrection thesis, that's just code for resurrection, it's true only if human persons are non-material beings. So you can only resurrect if you're a soul. But the problem is, of course, human persons are material beings. You're made of matter and nothing more. Animalism, right? Therefore, the general resurrection thesis is not true, and as an implication of that, right, Christianity is false. Pretty big issue. So this first premise I'm going to represent with these two swirly guys. We have to kill each premise in order to defeat it. So this is the idea that you are nothing more than a soul. And so he's kind of saying you only resurrect if you're a soul. So what we need to do is say, no, you can resurrect even if you're not a soul. And then in this second premise, we're resurrecting it with dancing Spock, we're representing it with dancing Spock. So here's where he's claiming human beings are material beings, so you're just matter and nothing more. We have to kill this idea, maybe, to defeat this premise. And this is a generalization of his argument, but I think it's a good way for us to proceed. So these two people will show up in the top left corner here, and that will tell you a little bit about which premise the view I'm presenting is attacking. And what we're going to do is span kind of a range of different views throughout this presentation. So let's start with trying to understand what we are, right? This is a great philosopher boyo named Joss Rasmussen, and he has a good way to try to understand or think about what you are. And he infers that at minimum, we must be a collection of atoms. Why does he say that? Well, the first thing you could be is not existing. But if you don't exist, there's a pretty big problem, because how do you doubt your existence if you don't exist? You have to exist. Does everyone agree with that? Awesome. Okay, so then we can move on to theory number 2. What if you're just a single atom, nothing more than that single core atom with quarks or electrons or whatever, that single core fundamental unit of the universe? Could you be that? What do you guys think? No? Okay. We have the rejection of atoms. That's a plausible theory. I think Alvin and probably most people are going to agree that this is a pretty silly theory. It seems like you are a little bit more at least than a single atom, right? It's also hard to understand mental reality about if you're just a single atom or nothing more than like a rock somewhere, because how can a mindless atom or a mindless fundamental unit of something think, right? So we've got some problems there that we need to work out. The third theory is that you're a collection of atoms or a group of things together. And this is a theory that has been around for a long time and received a lot of investigation and thoughts. And to kind of answer this, how you would resurrect on this theory, it's called reassembly theory. The idea is that God basically collects all of the atoms, all of the things that made you up, and puts them back together again. So when he does this, of course, they have the same causal history. They've had the same past, all these things that get broken up and put back together. And they're the same atoms in the same arrangement, which means you're the same person. You can think about this like a piece of a gun. Maybe if you took a gun apart and then you put all the pieces of the gun back together, the gun still exists, right? Just because the gun spent some time apart, because you put all those same pieces back in the same arrangement, it's still the same gun, right? That's kind of the idea to reassembly theory. And it works. You go, you die, your atoms then get scattered all over the planet, but as long as God gets all the right ones and puts them all back in the right space, you're good, right? And then he can subsequently transform you into this imperishable body, right? So there was one big problem with this that came up quite quickly, and this is the problem of the cannibals. The cannibals. So here's what happens. Joe, our nice little friend, he is a Christian. He goes to convert the people of Papua New Guinea or something, you know. He just wants to convert them. And he goes and poor little Joe gets eaten by, we'll call Bob. So Joe got eaten by Bob. Now, what happens when God wants to reassemble Joe and Bob, right, and resurrect them? Because Bob, of course, converts because Joe had a really awesome wife, you know. If you know the story of the Elliots, this actually sort of happened. Bob converts, and now God needs to bring back both Joe and Bob. But the problem is that parts of Joe are inside Bob, right? Or so it seems to go. How can God bring them back? Is he supposed to, like, cut off Joe's leg and give it to Bob, and then cut off Bob's arm and give it back to Joe? Are they supposed to come up terribly mangled? Like, how is this going to work, right? This is a big problem, and so a lot of people had solutions to it. In fact, people had solutions to this even before Jesus died on the cross. So the rabbis, they said you only need some parts. So there's a critical part of you that's an indestructible core part. It's part of the spinal cord, and that really grounds your existence. That part can't be destroyed, it can't be eaten, it can't be ingested by anybody else, and God will regrow you and reform you from that part alone. That part really is the essential grounding of your nature. So that's what the rabbis said. I think it's an interesting idea, right? This is what Jesus heard maybe growing up, so fun. I don't actually know how to pronounce his name. I'm going to go Athenagoras, but he said, actually, it's just impossible for Bob to eat Joe because Bob is a human, and Joe is also a human. A human can't ingest a human. So he said human beings can't absorb human flesh. It's not suitable to them. So we don't have a problem. Joe just goes right through Bob, and then you can resurrect both of them. The problem with this is we know now it's pretty much physically impossible, but this was a great idea at the time. Yes?
Did you test that theory?
I did not test this theory. I don't think anyone did historically that I'm aware of, but I could be wrong.
Would you have tested the theory if this was not recorded?
Perhaps. Then you have Augustine. Augustine basically said something along the lines of what the rabbis did, that you only need some parts, but the atoms will come back in the human body in which they first appeared, or there will be certain essential parts of those bodies, which God ensures never appear in other bodies, and he uses those essential parts to build back the rest of the body. Thomas Aquinas, interpreting Aquinas, just FYI, is a pain in the butt. It's very hard. There's a lot of nuance and arguments over him. So I'm just trying to give you a very cursory view, but he says the flesh is going to go, again, in whoever it was best equipped for. So something along the lines of what Augustine said, to whoever its perfection belonged more intimately. And then Aquinas, of course, likes to go a step further. So he goes to the radical cannibal. What do you do with somebody who only ate humans their whole life? Does this person exist? I don't know. I kind of doubt it, but maybe there are radical cannibals out there. He says they're going to resurrect from whatever they got from their parents. But what do you do with the child of two radical cannibals? Because Aquinas couldn't stop himself. He just said the semen would resurrect in the one who developed from the semen. You know, that's just what he says. I don't know what he's talking about. Most people don't. But he did actually spend time emphasizing and thinking about this, and I want us to pause for a moment to realize that even a guy who probably didn't hold any metaphysic that requires you to be physical really struggled with, like, how does the body come back, right? We also actually do have one reassembly theorist around today, Dr. Justin Mooney. You can see a video of his on the Analytic Christian. And he basically argues that, well, reassembly theory might have some problems, but it actually can be fixed just like all the other theories. And it might be a little bit better than all of them. It might be no worse off than everyone else. So reassembly theorists still exist. And then this is an interesting idea from David Hernshaw. And he basically says we could resurrect people gradually, and then we'll solve our problems. So let's just basically take Bob and resurrect Bob first, let him live out his life until all of his atoms get replaced with different atoms, and then take those same atoms and resurrect Joe. This way we kind of get both people for our buck. We get all the bang from our buck out of our atoms. We just need to have a little bit of a more gradual resurrection. I actually think that's plausible. It's an interesting idea. I haven't seen it explored much beyond that, but yeah, that's possible, right? So we have reassembly theory, and it seems like at least this is a plausible answer. Note we've already destroyed, right, premise one of Alpin's argument. Maybe there is a way on pure materialism that you could survive. But I want to point out that there are some problems with this theory. So we're kind of claiming that you're just a collection of all your atoms, right? Well, here's, we'll call him Jim. Jim is a nice, well-to-do standard citizen, and he gets into some trouble, and he loses his arm. But if reassembly theory is true, if we're just a collection of atoms, has Jim now turned to Jane? Like, what is going on, right? Jim and Jane are different people because they have different atoms. That sucks. So this is called the replacement problem. How do you continue as your atoms change? I think this is a solid problem that has caused people to move away from reassembly theory. But there are, again, other ideas of this. So maybe some of the ideas from like the rabbis or others that maybe are an essential core of unchanging atoms in a body of changing atoms. Maybe there are certain atoms that are fundamental or grounding. That's still, you know, in play. But if so, aren't we kind of returning to the idea that you're a single atom? Is that really kind of what we're doing? And how do we account for mental reality on that? So it seems like it's a little bit improbable or impossible, and we should maybe look to some other ideas. Here's all the other ideas. There's a lot, right? Because we can span all the way from materialism to immaterialism. So some theories. Theory 4, kind of, and then theory 5, you're a general arrangement of atoms. So maybe it's less important that you're these specific atoms and no more, but just that you're in the right shape in the arrangement of atoms. So different things can come in and out of that shape. Or that you're some sort of a unified whole that's either grounded in atoms or not. Or that you're not composed of atoms at all, which is the sole model that we've already probably come into this presentation thinking. So I want us to spend the rest of our time spanning this range, looking at tons of different views just briefly and trying to think about them. You'll note we've already got reassembly theory, and you'll note there's a color scheme. And again, remember our little icons in the corner. So here's the simulacrum model by Peter van Inwagen. He started off as an atheist and became a Christian, largely after thinking that, oh, actually, I can have resurrection on a materialist framework. So he's a Christian materialist. And he said, okay, what are you? You're some sort of a self-maintaining, immanently caused life generated from an organism made of matter. Your matter can be replaced, but as long as that life goes on, you exist. So how are we going to resurrect and survive on this? Well, you live out your life, and then right before your death, God does something. He takes your body, and he heals and transports it, or some key essential parts of it, like your brain, up to a planet or to another place, and he maintains it there in a comatose state, or in a sort of like heaven temporary pause state, right? And then, at the same time that he does that, he also builds a simulacra, or a fake identical body, and puts it in place of your current body, so that that simulacra, it goes on to be destroyed and to be dispersed across the whole universe. But really, the rest of you that's essential, it's off on some planet or some other place somewhere. And then, later, at the eschaton, he can bring that part back, revive it, transform it, and you're good. Now, you're all probably thinking, well, this is a really dumb idea, right? I grant you, it is probably a little bit of a dumb idea, but the point is that it's possible. And if it's possible that this is how it actually works, we have destroyed Alvin's argument technically, right? Because you did resurrect in a materialist model in this sense, right? So we have successfully done this. But I know you're all, most of you good kind of Christians, you're thinking this is still stupid. And more importantly, there's a really big downside, that this makes God out to be a big filthy liar, liar, pants on fire. Because he's replacing all of your loved ones with fakes, and you're watching and mourning them die in, tombs and so forth, but they're not actually them. They're off on a planet somewhere else, right? So we don't like, yes?
So when Jesus was put in the tomb, tell me,
Yes.
the tomb got rid of the simulacrum was disappearing.
Yes.
And he came back from Mars.
Yes, this is definitely a big problem with Jesus in particular, that the simulacra disappeared and he came back from Mars. Exactly. But again, it just has to work, and it does in fact work. We'll go through a few of them that just work, right? So here's our next one. This is by Dean Zimmerman. It's called the falling elevator model, the fission model, or the ontic leap model. He's taking the same identical thing you were in the previous model from Van Inwagen, and he's saying what happens is, as you live your life, as you reach that moment right before death, your atoms fission, and there's two of you. One fission set goes up, it might be on a planet or something somewhere, and then that part goes on to the resurrection, and the other fission set of you, basically, goes on and gets totally destroyed. Again, interesting idea, right? But it does technically work. It solves the problem. What he says it's doing is basically you're positing imminent causal connections that jump from the matter as it is dying, connecting the life to some other location where the crucial organic structure of the organism is preserved. So he says this fission event is like jumping out of an elevator right before it falls in the cartoons. You technically save yourself because you're causally connecting these atoms to you before, and you are also watching whatever gets destroyed. There's still a few problems to this. How would this actually work? How do atoms fission? Doesn't seem straightforward. Is it still a bit deceptive? Is God really still kind of faking you out on the corpse thing? And then there's a problem called closest continuous theory, which basically asks the question, which fission product is really you? And the answer that would seem to happen is that, well, whichever one's alive in a few seconds is what you are. But this means that who you are depends on the rest of the contingent world. Literally, who you are depends on what happens in the rest of reality. That seems kind of problematic. Do you want to be a different person if your best friend wore a red shirt sometime, one other day? You probably don't. So that seems like a problem. And what happens, just in case, if the corpse actually got revived after fission? So what happens if you fission, but then somehow doctors are able to bring back the corpse? Isn't that just the duplication problem back again, right? So there are some different problems with this view, but again, seems like there's some things that could be happening that would work. And I just want to point out, Kevin Corcoran has a similar view, but he just basically says you can fission across time and space. So you don't need to posit some sort of planet where the bodies are hanging out temporarily. You can just fission straight to the resurrection. Just in case you were worried about that. It has the same downsides as traditional theory. Now here's another view I want to spend a little bit more time on because I think it's kind of interesting. But have you ever heard of the concept of space-time? Yes, okay, Audrey's heard of the concept of space-time. The idea here is that all things that exist are chunks of both space and time. Space-time is an actual thing, it's an entity, and it makes up all that exists. So, gravity, warp, space-time fields, things like that. You essentially are a collection of space-time. And matter is most fundamentally a region or derivative of space-time. So you are the matter and time that exist in a given space. So if you spread space-time out, it's kind of like a loaf, and you're kind of like a worm threading throughout this loaf. This is the idea that you are a space-time worm. So how do you exist? Well, you have time parts, and so the time parts of you persist, and your matter just joins back later. So this gap, or this kind of pause where it seems like there's a gap between your existence and not, it's not really a gap at all. You've just lobbed off the matter part of you. But the rest of you as a space-time worm is still good, and you can reattach that part later. So it's like losing your thumb and having surgeons sew it back on. You're still in existence. Anyone kind of confused by this one? Yes? No specific confusion. Okay. I'm trying to think if there's a good way to draw it.
Like if you lost your space component, but you still have the time component?
Yes. Yes. And another way to think of it is like the past, the present, and the future are all existing, and you're a region within the past, present, and future. But there's just a point in that region in which you don't have matter. But you still have your time component, right?
So, like a soul.
It's like a soul, but not a soul. It's all material, because it says that all that is in existence is just space and time. Yes?
Well, if that's the case, if the material thing is space-time, like it's just one thing,
Yes.
how can you separate the time from the space? It would cease to be space-time and just be time.
It's still a space-time, like you can still have a space-time block in space, like with it where there's no matter in it. It's still a part of space-time, technically. So the space-time block doesn't have to have like matter in it per se. Just like if you imagine like you and yourself truly, you're exchanging, you're losing and gaining atoms all the time. So if you kind of think of yourself as that region that gains and loses atoms, that has causal continuance from the past you to the present you to the future you, this is just saying the past, present, and future you all exist, and you're always gaining and losing atoms. There just happens to be a period where you lost all the atoms and gained them all. But that region always still exists. Jet.
Makes time a material property?
Yes, it does make that time a material, well, space-time a material property, but you have to go into the physics to actually understand that.
Naturalists believe in time?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of naturalists tend to like space-time as kind of a concept and a view. So I actually think Alvin might find this fairly interesting and something to think on or to rational with. There is a downside, of course, that you are holding to a B theory of time, or the idea that space-time is the fundamental thing of reality. And there is still a possible closest continuer issue, because how do you really wrap space-time worms, and what makes one space-time worm different than another? You still have questions to solve. Yes?
What would God be?
God would still be outside of the material universe, so outside of space-time. He would still be a beyond object in that sense, yeah. So the whole universe in this case would be like the loaf of bread, and you're the space-time worm that winds through it. But God would be beyond that loaf. Yes? Yeah, the potential closest continuer issue is if you have multiple space-time worms that like overlap in different ways and they split in different ways. Would you say that you're a duplicate or not of a different space-time worm?
Could you just modify it then by just taking a more functional approach, like quantum mechanics?
Yeah, you could do some. I think you could do something like that. I'd have to ask a little bit more into the full. You'd have to probably ask Michael at the end of the day if that would really work. There's even something called hypertime where you go past this and you have like a loaf that causes a loaf that causes a loaf, but you know, maybe that's how you do it. I don't even understand that fully, so. But yeah, that's another possible. So here's another one. This is a Lockean identity perspective. This says that most fundamentally what you are, or your soul, if you will, is just your software. It's your consciousness, maybe your memories, your brain structure, or some sort of an information-bearing pattern of some sort. You've probably heard a lot of people think like this. Well, I'm just like my brains and my memories and my kind of structure of my brain, and that's really most fundamentally what I am. You're the being that in some appropriate way inherits its mental features from its past self, right? So how do you survive on this? Well, it's pretty simple, right? Anyone who later has the same software is you, because that software is what grounds your existence. So as long as that software comes back again, that software is you. God just needs to give you the same structure or pattern or memory or consciousness, and you're good to go. That's how you're going to kind of resurrect on this view. But there are some difficulties with views like this, and one is called the brain-minus problem. So this says if you're a material structure or a brain, then you can imagine that there's some fundamental, small, insignificant part, like an atom, that you could remove from that structure, and it would be a different structure, but really not really. Like, let's imagine you've lost your memory of somebody who once wore a green shirt, and you replaced it with a red shirt or something. You have two different things. You have the brain originally, and then you have the structure minus that one insignificant thing, be it a memory or like a small atom that really does nothing in the overall structure. But these are two different entities. So are you the brain, or are you brain minus an atom, right? Which one of these is you? Because they are different, but this one's insignificantly different to this. So it seems like there could be a lot of yous if you are a brain structure, consciousness entity of some sort. In fact, there could be like thousands and thousands and thousands of yous. And that's a bit of a problem because it doesn't seem like there are thousands and thousands of yous living in your brain. It seems like there's just one, right? So this is kind of a problem for some of these Lockean identity perspectives. But I will point out a lot of them get more sophisticated. They can fix issues like this. They'll talk about different things. But this is kind of the overall kind of, how does this really work? I also want to point out that there still intuitively, at least to me, seems like there could be some sort of a duplication problem here. Because it seems like all we've done is replaced the physical things with mental structure A, mental structure B, and a mental history. It still seems to me like there's maybe an issue there. Lynn Baker, actually, what she says is, identity is a one-to-one relation, but person A's quasi-memory, software, information-bearing pattern, and so on, could be transferred to more than one person. So sameness of quasi-memory, software, or information-bearing pattern can't suffice for sameness of person. It seems like if your software can be downloaded to multiple people, then really you aren't you, in a sense, right? You could just be an infinite number of yous. This is a problem. We don't like that. So that's kind of the Lockean perspective. This is a perspective by Trenton Merricks. He's an agnostic. We're starting to merge into areas where we're really confronting both views simultaneously, or we're kind of on the edge between. Yes, Michael?
Agnostic about personal identity.
Yes, sorry. He is agnostic about personal identity only, not about other things. So what he says is what you are can't actually be defined in a nice little box because of reasons like what happens if you replace one insignificant atom, or how many yous are you. He says that actually there are no criteria of personal identity, biological, otherwise. You will be raised, and maybe surprisingly, there need be no explanation of this. So what he's doing is he's saying there are no necessary and sufficient identity conditions that you have to reference to know if something is itself. In fact, that every attempt to do so ends up being circular, because to try to say what makes a thing, you have to say what a thing is in order to say what makes a thing a thing. So you're always going to argue in circles. So he kind of sums up our problem and Alvin's problem as don't worry, be happy. Because you don't need to worry about this. The problem's actually impossible. You can't have another thing that exists, and it can be its thing. The Colossus can come across the gap just because it is its thing. And it doesn't really need anything more than that. It just is the Colossus because it is, right? So that's his approach. I actually do think a lot of people seem to view this positively from the philosophical literature. I don't like it because it feels like it's a cop-out, but at the same time, maybe there are no identity conditions, and we just need to like get over it. So here's another one called the Divine Command Model by Dean Zimmerman. What are you on here? Some sort of unified whole, maybe a Lockean thing. We don't really need to go into specifics on what we are. But the kind of claim we're being told is, okay, I go, I die, and then God maybe rebuilds me. And he just kind of rebuilds me out of nothing, or I just pop into existence, right? And this says, actually, that's not how it works. You don't really just pop into existence out of nothing or with no cause. What God does is he commands, make somebody in the next world who is just like Jane and John Doe when they cease to exist. And his command has to pull back to the current you sitting in your chair in order to work. He needs to have you currently cause yourself, in a sense. Because you being the thing that you are is what makes you come to be the thing that you are in the resurrection. For example, if you didn't exist right here, right now, if God commanded, make Alyssa exist, his command wouldn't do anything. Because God really actually isn't doing it alone. There is a causation between you and the next you that comes about. So what he's kind of saying here is, as long as that causation is here, as long as God's command pulls from the you now to make the you later, you've caused yourself in a real way, just like your past self in this morning caused you to be here. So you are good. You've maintained yourself. You've caused yourself, and that's all that we need to maintain our identities. So this is kind of an idea of pulling really from God. And then here's another one by Stephen T. Davis. He's actually more of a theologian than a philosopher, so give him a little slack on his philosophy. But he kind of has an idea that I would summarize as God thinks, therefore you are. So he's going to say all causal processes, everything that is caused or comes into existence, not just miraculous ones, they actually pass through the mind of God. There's no such thing as the self-maintenance of a living thing. So you remember where Lynn Baker said, well, you have to be an identity that kind of causes yourself in order to exist. He says that's not true. Everything that exists and is caused is always being caused by God. You'll remember verses like, he sustains and upholds us. All things are held into being by him. What are some other ones? I'm trying to think. Yeah, he upholds the world by his power, right? So there's this idea that actually everything that's caused and that continues to exist is caused and continues to exist by God. So to point it pretty straightforward, what makes an apparent replica of X be X is just God's will that the apparent replica be X, because he's always part of that causal process. He's always bringing the causation. And so it's always really going through him, and there's not really anything that's changed in that gap or in that period in between. He's always been causing it, and he's continuing to cause it. So he's causing you just because he's willing that you be X. So really, it's not I think, therefore I am. It's God thinks, therefore you are, right? So apart from his activity, contingent beings which have no inherent power to preserve their existence would just lapse into non-existence. That's kind of the claim here. So again, we are now attacking ideas that all you have to be is matter to exist, but we're saying, God actually is a part of it, and it's very consistent in our theology to do something like this. Yes, Audrey.
How does this work with the view that God is resurrected from his creation, that he's no longer created?
I don't think, at least theologically, that anyone, does it go into a panentheism is what you're asking? Okay, can you say your question in a different way, maybe?
Like on how on the seventh day of creation God rested from his creation. So under this view is God constantly creating?
Okay, yeah. So when we think of God's rest, and in the seventh day of creation, he rested, most, I think, theologians, or at least also critical scholars, don't think that rest is just a passive rest. It's an active rest, which means he's still doing things in part of his creation and maintaining things. It's not a rest such that he's like a watchmaker and he just stepped out of the world in existence. In fact, Christ, right, is in existence. He's always been involved. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a contradiction to hold that both God is resting and yet he's always causally sustaining the universe. Okay, so now here's the Constitution view. This is by Lynn Baker. What she's going to say is what you are. You are a person constituted by a human body at some part of your existence. We're getting into the more very philosophical kind of view, so we're going to have to unpack what they mean by almost every word. First of all, what is a person? A person is a first-person perspective. It's the thing that thinks, therefore it is. It's the thing that I call myself. I am me. I see through my eyes. I am myself. That is the person. A person's a first-person perspective. And a human is just animalism, basically, the thing constituted by a human body or organism. So what you are is you're a person constituted by a human body. What does constitution mean? Constitution is basically something that happens when various things are put in various circumstances that bring about new things with new causal powers. So here's an example. You have a statue made of copper blocks on, well, we won't talk about what it's on, but you probably recognize the software. But we know that, of course, over time, if we broke this whole thing down, it would just be copper blocks, and we would have no statue. But when we put all these blocks together, at some point, we have something called a statue. And this statue is different than the blocks that made it up. It's something new. It's something beyond the blocks. It has new causal powers. It can be beautiful. It can be amazing in a way that the blocks just can't. So this statue has come into existence from the raw materials, but it is something more than the blocks. What we would say is that the statue is constituted by the copper, but it is more than the copper. In the same way, your first-person perspective is constituted or made up just by your body, but it's also something more than your body, right? But not an immaterial floating something. It is just something that is more by definition of it being constituted in the copper. Not exactly a one-to-one identity map there. And so what she says is when you die, it's basically the permanent and irretrievable loss of this ability to think of yourself from a first-person perspective. You can't think, therefore you aren't, right? So you're probably asking some questions. Well, oh my gosh, what happens when I sleep? She's going to say, no, you're fine. You still have the capacity for a first-person perspective, so you're still alive, you're still good. Oh my gosh, what happens to my baby? Is my baby not a person? She's going to say, no, it has a rudimentary first-person perspective, so maybe it's not a robust one, but it's naturally going to become a robust first-person perspective. It is still alive, right? What about your comatose mom, if you have some comatose mom in a hospital somewhere? So long as the comatose mom has the ability to regain the first-person perspective, still alive. But if they're brain dead, if the brain is gone, there's no first-person perspective potential, then yeah, truly and completely dead. And you're probably asking, well, in virtue of what does a resurrected person have the same first-person perspective as me now? Why will I in the resurrection be myself? Why will I be the same person perspective? She's going to answer there's no real non-circular answer to that question, so she's going to kind of be with the agnostic Trenton Merricks on this. But she's going to say it's a primitive and unanalyzable fact, but importantly, there is a fact of the matter. You know if you are because you think, right? You think, therefore you are. So you are going to know if you're the first person perspective in the resurrection because you will be you, right? And she says there's really no threat of the duplication problem on this view because it's metaphysically impossible for one person to be identical to two persons. It's impossible for you to say I have the same first person perspective as somebody else because it's a first person perspective, right? I can never see through David Dockery's eyes no matter how much I want to. He will never be able to see through mine. He has a unique first person perspective and it just is his. So we don't need to worry about the duplication problem because it's metaphysically impossible for two first person perspectives to be identical. And so if it's metaphysically impossible, God can't do it. He cannot make a stone so heavy he cannot lift it, right? It doesn't make any sense. So that leads me to another view. This is called emergent dualism. So now we're getting into the views that really properly say you have a soul of some sort, an immaterial thing that exists that grounds you. But the unique thing about this view, which is held by Hassner, is that you're a soul that emerged naturally during the course of biological evolution. So you can kind of think of this as similar to the statue emerging from the copper. But this soul that emerges as an actual immaterial kind of existing thing, as opposed to in Lynn Baker's view, it's all still matter, really. The first person perspective emerges from the matter, but it's part of the matter. This soul is generated by natural biological processes. It's located spatially and sustained by your body and your brain. But importantly, with God's assistance, it can actually be maintained apart from the body that generates it. So you can kind of think of your soul like the electromagnetic field that gets generated when electrons move through a circuit. I just realized many of you are business majors, and I'm trying to think of a new way to phrase this. The light that gets generated when you turn on a lamp. So yes, your soul is kind of just generated from your body and the things that exist. And so how you survive is, of course, your soul gets sustained by God post your death and then reunited with a body. There are some benefits to this. So proponents claim is they say there's no real mind-body problem because the soul has arisen naturally from the things that exist. So you don't need to basically say that the soul comes first and then it gets united with matter. What you say is actually the matter comes first and then it generates a soul. So matter has primacy in this view. There's some downsides, though, or some difficulties. How does this actually work? It seems like we're also positing like psychophysical laws, like physical things are somehow causing psychological things. And do we have even proof for that? And then I still think there's an element where maybe you haven't gotten away from the brain minus problem. Because couldn't many people come from one brain, right? How much is one atom significant in the generation of the soul? How many souls can be generated from X arrangement of matter? This seems to be another problem that we still haven't solved. Yes?
Yeah, what about schizophrenia?
I'm not sure I see how schizophrenia applies.
It's not schizophrenia. He means dissociative identity disorder where someone has a split personality.
Oh.
Not schizophrenia.
For Lynn Baker's view or for this view? For this view? I do not know how dissociative identity disorder would work. You'd actually have to ask somebody who holds to emergent dualism for that, because that's a pretty niche answer. You'd also have to ask Lynn Baker for that, because that seems like maybe a potential first-person perspective issue too, right? But the difference there is only certain perspectives are around at certain times. So maybe there's just a very confused soul that grounds it all. Or you can hold the demons work and you could still like potentially solve that problem as a Christian, not on an atheistic framework, but maybe you can solve it that way. And so there's only one soul, but there's a bunch of demons. I don't know. You can figure that out later. But that's emergent dualism. And now we get to hylomorphic or Thomistic dualism. So this is what the TI holds, Thomists. Kind of the idea of what does Aristotle and Aquinas say. Aristotle and Aquinas were concerned about the idea of change. How do things persist through change? That was actually their big problem. And what they said is, actually, we can solve this problem if we posit the universe is made of two fundamental things, form and matter. This is called hylomorphism. Things that exist are matter and form together. Form is what gives you your stable identity through time. It's like chairness. Chairness is a form. And that form is chairness, or mapness, or clothedness. That's the form. It gives you stable identity through time, and it's associated with what actually exists. Matter is actually just shaped by form, and it makes up what's physically there, but it's associated more with potentially what may exist. So what you have is things that are made of actual and potential. And that's what really exists, is things that are made of actually things that exist in the forms, like a chair, and then potential, or things that can be else, can be otherwise. in different arrangements. In fact, they go so far as to say there's something called prime matter, which is just pure potentially, so stuff that hasn't been given a form. You could associate this in your mind with maybe like quantum indeterminacy or something like that. And so when you say something's essence, you're really calling that its substantial form. And the essence is basically all of something's formal and material causes taken together. So it gives you kind of the thing that it is. The substantial form is the form that makes you the thing that you are. Just like chair, this chair, has the form of chairness, and that's what really makes it a chair. If I rip it apart and it no longer has the form of chair, it's not a chair. It has lost the form of chairness. The thing that makes it a chair is that it has the form of chair. And this is associated or related to existence. So if essences are basically that have been actualized into reality, that's what exists. So that's the hylomorphic things. Your soul is your substantial form. So it is the form that makes you, you. Your body is the matter that it is united with. Everyone track with this so far? Okay, so again, the thing that you are is a soul body thing. And that is what really exists. So when you have death and when you die, your soul and your body are separated. Your form, your soul, it doesn't cease to exist. It continues to exist without your body. And that's your substantial form. But again, it's not a thing, right? Because things are inherently form matter things. It's just the form. It's the thing that maintains your identity. But in a sense, it's not you. So you need to divorce this soul from your concept of you. It's not you. Human beings aren't fully complete without both soul and body. So when you resurrect, your soul, your substantial form, will be united with your body, and that will give you yourself. But again, your soul isn't like you in its fullness. Your soul is just the thing that grounds what you are, but it's only going to be fully and completely you as a thing, an existing thing, when it's reunited with matter. So that's one important thing here to, yes, understand, yes.
How does this view handle heaven, hell, or in the Catholic view, purgatory, where you have some sort of middle existence between the physical earth right now and the new earth later, and it's the in-between part?
Yes, to be honest, I've struggled to figure out exactly how how purgatory works on this view, because your soul is, in a sense, you are a very damaged thing when you are split from your body, because it's an unnatural and unhealthy state to be in. It's not you aren't really human. You're not a full person because your soul is not united with matter. So there are ways that this goes about, but I'd actually encourage you to look more into asking the TI and people, just because I don't want to give a wrong answer to that question. But they do flesh it out that purgatory and things like that work. But of course, you aren't your fullest self until you're really reunited with body. And I will point out, right, if we have some bishops earlier on who are confused about whether you're not a spirit later on, that you've got some conflicts of cross-Catholicism, so you're going to want to go to the philosophers to really answer that question. Oh, yes?
So, in this view, going off of her question, could God say, take your soul and reunite it with a different body,
Yes.
and then you would be yourself? So could that maybe be where heaven and earth are? He's just taking your soul and he's putting it in a different matter, in a different place?
Yes, yeah. In this view, God could reunite your soul with pretty much any body, and it would be you. So it doesn't even need to be the same physical body you're sitting with right now.
Just matter.
Just matter of some sort, yes. And then you're good. Okay, and then we finally have substance dualism or Cartesian dualism, which states you essentially most fundamentally are an immortal soul. So again, your body is not you. On this view, your body is not you. You are a soul, and that soul remains consistent across through your death and into the new resurrection, and that is what makes you you. So there is a big downside for this view, which you've probably heard before. It's called the mind-body problem. If you fundamentally are an immaterial thing, and that's the primary thing that you are, how on earth are you interfacing with a material thing, right? How do you get this connection between the immaterial and the material? This is a tough problem. And so I want to point out all of the views we've looked at, spanning all the way from materialism to immaterialism. They had their ups and they had their downs. It's very confusing and difficult. So I really want us to wrestle with Alvin in things like this. What we've proven and what we've gone through is that it's at least metaphysically possible that Christ was raised and that we can be raised. So we've kind of answered his problem. We've looked at his argument in all sorts of ways, and we've realized there are solutions to this, but it's not an easy problem. So let's join Alvin in that and think a bit more critically about who we are and the glory of Easter, that if Christ really did die, we can really be raised and was raised, then we can too. And here's just a nice kind of poem for us to meditate on while we ask more questions. Okay, any more questions? Are we done? Perfect, okay. Read this, though, it's awesome.